Chapter 13. David was sitting on the fence that surrounded the exercise area. He was staring at the warriors who, like little children, threw paper planes at the target. "I've hit on the middle," shouted suddenly one of the armed soldiers. The boy jumped off a high fence, went to the training dummies and began to bang a large sword on one of them. David had to prepare well for the journey to the city of Nathan to save King Hurin with his companions. Lord told the boy that the mission would start in 4 days. During this time, David had to train and prepare all the necessary things for that mission. Suddenly, a familiar voice behind David's back said, "Do you want to go hunting with me?" David turned around surprised and saw Metkul, who quickly became his good friend. "Well, I think so. Well, I mean, I can," the boy replied hesitantly. "That's great. Will we hunt deer? There are a lot of them in these forests, or maybe 4 bears. David didn't know what to say for a moment. He would definitely choose the first one, but he thought that maybe Metkul would call him a coward when he chose to hunt deer. It can be on, probably bears," the boy said after a while. "Really? Bears? It can be risky. In these forests live really large and dangerous teddy bears. These monsters are too aggressive and brutal. Fortunately, they wouldn't even touch you because they wouldn't have a need. They wouldn't eat you at all." "Ha, ha, ha, ha," laughed the great warrior. "Yay, very funny. Ha, 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 so funny that I would immediately faint with laughter." The boy, who was not in such a mood, was outraged. "I was only joking, David. Their meat is not very good. Only the skin is good, but we don't have to expose ourselves unnecessarily," Metkul replied. "Okay, and where will we hunt?" David asked. "Well, in the forest, maybe in the east," replied the warrior, whose statement sounded more like a question. David looked at east. There was a dense forest with unusually tall trees. "Is it there?" he asked to make sure. "Yes," Metkul replied briefly in a strangled voice after a recent laugh. The warrior would bounce back and begin to say further. "I bring you such good bow from our lord's collection. Hendron has about 120 bows in his warehouse, so without hesitation he let one of them belong to you." David was clogged for a moment. Only after a long while he spoke in a squeaky voice. "Why does this guy collect such a lumber and have this something as much as he has?" Metkul, hearing this stupid statement of a little friend, replied in an amused voice, "Our lord is not a fool. All these bows are trophies. Each bow comes from a different country. He is only missing to collect weapons from Masoko, Pilindi and Sissa, Gorhia and probably Alia." Hearing this, the boy whistled in shock, nodding his head in appreciation. "And my bow? Where does it come from? Show it to me," shouted the boy impatiently. "Calm down, little boy, calmly, not in that tone to me. I'm about to give you this weapon and you promise to politely thank to our illustrious lord," Metkul replied, reaching behind his back. After a while, he took out something he had hidden behind his robe and showed it to David. In the eyes of the boy there was an expression of surprise and disappointment. He saw in the soldier's big hand small, wooden and longitudinal 3 blocks joined together. At the very tip of one of the parts was fixed rope. "This is a not funny joke. It's supposed to be a bow. It reminds me more of a toy whip for kids. What is it supposed to be at all? Give it better to Serema as a weapon," David screamed indignantly, seeing a wooden toy. "Calm down, David. Everyone hears you. Who did you even learn this behavior from? I have reason to be disappointed to see some wooden Lego bricks with a string at the end in front of me." David, Nathan was apparently right. "You are actually probably sick with something. This bow is one of Eureka's most powerful weapons. By showing me this thing you say that I see a powerful weapon in front of me. Yes, I know you're making fun of me. I'm not going to believe you this time. How is it handled? It would not even be possible to shoot and rest." Hearing this, Metkul became angry, reached behind his back again and pulled out a tiny quiver full of arrows. He threw it to the ground and began to do something with primitive weapon. The soldier bent all 3 pieces of wood and pressed his finger in some place. When he did this, long gilded and curved sticks came out of the pieces of wood. Immediately afterwards, Metkul grabbed a string attached, which turned out to be a bowstring. The warrior put it on and threw a toy on the ground, which turned out to be a strange, folding bow. Seeing this, David's eyes were shaken and his mouth open. His face now resembled the face of a terrified fish. "It's a folding bow. Never seen one," an angry Metkul said. "Sorry. I didn't know," replied a repentant David, who felt stupid. Metcalf must have tried to make him happy, and he came at him like a rampant brat. The warrior stood motionless with his head down, staring at the ground where there was a folded bow and a quiver with arrows scattered. "Sorry, Metcalf, I'm sorry, I'm so distracted, kid," the boy said again in a trembling voice. This time, Metcalf took note of David's apology and looked up, looking the boy straight in the eyes. "Apology accepted. To tell the truth, when I was little, I also made fun of this weapon," he finally spoke in the most normal voice. David nodded his head as a sign that he understood and put his right hand out of his pocket to reconcile with the giant. Metcalf shook the boy's tiny hand with a big hand. David felt a sudden jerk of his hand and a hug so strong that he soothed in pain. It was only after a long while that the warrior stopped jerking the young man's hand. "You broke my hand. Maybe next time you will greet or settle for a little less brutal war." David did not finish his speech because at the moment the big paws of the giant embraced him and hugged him. Metcalf hugged a little friend with all his strength, saying amused, "Come here, little brat." David's bones crackled. "Oh!" shouted the boy, who got weak and stuffy in a big hug. After a while, he fell silent because he felt that he was suffocating. Metcalf patted him on the back, of course in a friendly way, but David felt as if he was being shaken by the trunk of an elephant. David shouted to the giant, but it sounded like a loud yell. The warrior heard this voice full of pain, so he let go of the boy. David breathed a sigh of relief, but after a while he fell to the ground. "Bones hurt me, everything hurts me, my poor guts," he coughed. "I'm so sorry, I'm not accustomed to squeezing and huging little ones like you," the giant replied to his friend. "So get used to it," the boy replied hoarsely, squeezing his sore throat. "Okay, I'll try to remember not to squeeze you and hug so tightly, and now let's finally go on this hunt. Take the bow and let's go." "Yes, but there is a little problem," David began, "is that I can't shoot a bow." "How's that?" Metcalf was surprised. After all, everyone from an early age learns hunting in Ethinestra. "Didn't your father teach you to shoot a bow? After all, a bow is the basis of survival. What if you got lost in the woods during your travel to Nelthorn? I guess you wouldn't hunt animals with a sword." David lowered his gaze. He didn't know what to answer. "You must have at least touched the bow once in your life," Metcalf said. "Well, yes, I had a bow, but only in computer games," boy replied quickly, but after a while he realized that he had burned out another stupidity. He often said something before he thought about it. The giant made a strange face when he heard an unfamiliar word. "In which games?" he asked after a while. "Well, probably, you heard something wrong," said the terrified boy, not knowing what to say in this bad situation. "I have good hearing. You said something about compiling games. What kind of game is this?" "It's complicated, it's just this, it's such a team game," David probably replied at the very end. In a way, it was true. "So you had a bow in your hand," said the warrior. "Well, as if I had a bow in such a virtual hand," the young man replied through clenched teeth. "What does that mean?" asked Metcalf quietly, terrified of his eyes. "Metcalf, it's really not important. Please answer me what this compilation game is and what that virtual hand means." Hearing this, David began to beat himself in a frenzy with an open hand on the head. "I will not say what it is," shouted the boy suddenly. "This is something you will not understand, not grasp it, so give me a holy peace." David was still beating his head. "I'm just making sure that you're actually okay, David. Nathan had already told me about your behavior once," the giant replied calmly. "Don't worry about me, everything is fine with me," replied David, who finally stopped beating his head. "Good, maybe I'd better teach you to shoot a bow before hunting," Metcalf replied slowly with a strange expression on his face. "Something wrong?" David asked. David had been shooting aim shields from his new toy bow for several minutes. "How do you stretch the bowstring?" said Metcalf suddenly, who was watching the young man's work. "And what am I doing wrong?" asked David, rolling his eyes. "After all, you do not stretch the bow with your thumb and index finger. Besides, you keep the bow too far apart," answered the giant, who just sat on one of the stumps. "So how I must done this supposedly? After all, the bow is stretched with arrow finger, indicating and middle finger. From a distance you look like you were. Looks like pulling an ordinary string. It looks like you're playing one string of a harp." "Ha, ha, ha, ha," Metcalf burst out at the end with a loud laugh. "Very funny, So ridiculous that I'm going to die from this giggling. The boy was outraged when he saw a laughing friend who grabbed his stomach to stop the amusement. David lowered the bow and grabbed his saw head. Broken. Be quiet. I am working on developing a new paper bird. I'll see if it's suitable as an arrowhead. David suddenly heard Serenma's familiar voice behind him, so he turned around. You're interfering with my work. Be quiet, the scout said again to Metcalf, who was still laughing. The second wise one. Do you think that a paper bolt head can kill someone? Metcalf laughed even more when he heard the bowmaster speak. Of course not, you idiot. On paper, it's easy to write. This arrow will be used to convey messages. The range will be much greater when a paper bird can be shot with a bow and not thrown from the palm of your hand. Soon, thanks to David, I will be famous. The whole world will know that I will be the most famous scout, shouted Serema, raising his hands upwards. David listened to all this and after a while decided to join the conversation. Sorry, but what about me? Serema turned to the young man with a flick, at the same time majestic movement of his head, and replied, Oh, David, you too will be famous. For such inventions you get tons of gold. For making ordinary airplanes out of paper, you can live here good like a donut in butter, thought David. Oh, I see, David, that you are learning to shoot a bow. I'll teach you, my friend, how to do it. This giggling fool will certainly not teach you anything. The only thing you can learn from him is to make a fool of himself. Right, my friend? David was clogged. He didn't know what to answer. If he had agreed with the scout, he would have offended Metcalf. In the end, the boy decided to answer. This is not true. Metcalf is good. And anyway, why are you so much bad for him? It's a massacre. Even I didn't bully others like you at school, Serema. When Metcalf wants to reconcile with you, you start beat him with your belt right away. David finished his brutal statement. Serema was completely stunned like a wart-up. It was only after a long while that the scout twitched and bended over the low teenager, putting his hands on his shoulders. Do you know why I'm so harassing this clown? Said the scout, looking to David straight in the eyes. I am so bad to him for the fact that he was bad for me. Understand? But Metcalf said that when he wants to reconcile with you, you react with aggression. It's a shame to see. Shame on you. Even I didn't care so much about those little ones at school, the boy yelled. That's very interesting. I can tell you a saying, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I heard this from a Raven Murtagh himself. It's the same thing as destroying life for destroying life. When I was little, Metcalf could have abused me so. I don't want to listen to it anymore. Can't you just let go? I'm going better with Metcalf for hunting. I don't like having such conversations like that, shouted David. Then he picked up his bow from the ground and jumped over the fence. Immediately after him, Metcalf walked slowly. Goodbye, I wish you a good hunt. David heard the mocking voice of the scout behind him. The boy turned backwards and saw Serema waving at him. Behind him was Celian, who apparently did not want to be noticed by the elder scout. The boy turned his eyes west again and began to walk with Metcalf towards the forest. They passed several tents, jumped over the sharpened piles surrounding the camp, and after a while found themselves outside the eternal camp in a clearing. In front of them stretched a colorful, dense forest. Because of this fool I did not even have time to accustom you to the bow. I hope you can handle it, Metcalf said to David suddenly. The boy nodded. I will be okay somehow, he assured. In fact, however, he had doubts. He didn't even know if he had the courage to shoot a living creature. The conversation was interrupted and there was a deafening silence. To have just entered the forest, David felt the incredibly clean air and the smell of tall, old trees. It's a real paradise, he shouted, seeing a stream with delightfully crystalline water. Quieter, because you will scare the animals out, Metcalf replied quietly but firmly. Sorry, I forgot oneself, the boy justified himself. After a while, he bowed his head so that he could drink from the stream. The boy felt in his mouth a refreshing, sweetish taste of the wonderful liquid. Immediately afterwards, he doused his entire face for refreshment and pulled the hood off his head to wash his light, slightly dirty hair. Is it going to be a long time, right? Said Metcalf. Give me just a moment, David replied calmly, dipping and washing his hair in the water. It's just water, the giant said. For you it is only a water, and for me it is a real paradise in my mouth. How did your parents feed and drink you, if ordinary water is a paradise for you? Metcalf was surprised. Believe me, I've never drank anything better than that, said the boy, who began to pour all the clean water over himself. "What, haven't you drank anything better? After all, it is the most ordinary water in the world." David finally got up in quite wet clothes and turned to his friend. "To tell the truth," said the boy, but he did not finish his speech, because behind him suddenly sounded a disturbing loud roar. He turned and saw a large bear's body among the trees. "Do not move, do not be afraid, because this beast will sense it. In a second, nothing will be left of you," Metkul said quietly, in a broken voice. David twitched. "Do not move or it will reach you in one moment." Hearing this, the boy was terrified. His heart was pounding like a crazy and he couldn't do anything. A bear almost 3 meters high stared from the other side of the stream at the terrified young man. "What should I do?" the boy asked Metkul, struggling to stop a shaking voice. "Nothing," David heard his companion's brief reply and then felt him grabbing his hand. After a while, Metkul was already running with David under his arm towards the clearing. The boy had his head in the back so he could clearly see the approaching monster with his big eyes out. "Faster, it is close," informed David for Metkul. Suddenly, the boy felt a strange twitch. Metkul tripped over a root protruding from the ground. The giant fell to the ground with a bang, and David landed next to him on his back. After a while, he saw the beast clench its teeth on Metkul's leg and begin to drag it behind him. The giant grabbed a root with his hand to stop for a moment, but it made the situation even worse because the bear jerked Metkul's leg mercilessly. The man screamed in pain and the monster began to pull him back. David wanted to help his friend, but he felt great pain in his back. As soon as he raised his head more, he began to feel a tearing pain to the marrow. In the end, the boy got his act together. He grabbed a tree and rose very quick. He writhed in pain as he did it so. Fortunately, he was already on his feet so it was easier to act. After a while, David found out why his back hurt so much. The place from which he just got up was a large stone which had to stick into his spine. With difficulty, he lifted the bow from the ground and came closer to the beast. Now the most difficult stage awaited him. He had to pull an arrow out of a quiver with a saw hand to kill the beast that was dragging his companion with him. With a great cry of pain, David managed to pull an arrow from behind his back and put it on his bowstring. Unfortunately, the bear realized what was going on, so for a moment he dropped the victim from his mouth and growled menacingly to David as if he wanted to chase him away. However, the boy was not impressed and released the arrow. The arrow plunged into the thick, dirty leather into the head of a giant bear. The small arrow, however, did not kill the huge bear and the beast became furious. Now David had become a new aim of the bear. The forest monster began to run towards him, and David sucked his teeth in terror. Only now he realized that this bear, even if it stands on 4 paws, is taller than him. The boy stand in place. He stated that even escaping would not help at all. In his opinion, it was simply too late. All he could do was pulling out a dagger to defend himself for a while. David after a while could not stand it and began to scream, but when the bear was already 5 meters away from the boy, a small, white thing tapped his big head. After a while, this thing fell to the ground. David was astonished to find that it was a paper plane. The bear stopped and looked in the direction from where the plane had come from. David also looked there, to the right, and saw Celian. "Help Metkul, I'll distract him," shouted the young scout to David and then began to flee. An irritable bear ran right after him. David ran to Metkul. Blood wept abundantly from the giant's hurt leg. "Help Celian, David," shouted Metkul to the boy. "But you have to stop the bleeding," David wrote, seeing his friend's leg bleeding. "Believe me, David, in some battles I was more seriously wounded, and now help Celian before this beast tears him apart. I can handle it myself, by the way." David agreed, and as soon as he could, he ran sorely toward the south, where Celian fled. It wasn't long after David found himself in a small clearing. In the middle was a large tree on which a terrified Celian was sitting. The bear jumped up trying to catch the scout. "Of course I forgot to take my arrows," the young man said to himself in a broken voice, and after a while he began to scream. "Help!" Hearing this, David grabbed the dagger and moved towards the tree. Celian noticed him. "Better run. It is better that this beast eats only one of us." "Ouch!" Celian shouted at the very end because a bear had just grabbed his foot. Fortunately, the monster did not manage to throw the scout off, but the young man was now hanging on a branch holding only his hands. The bear jumped up again to catch the prey again, but something suddenly stopped him. David saw a large axe being pounded into the creature's body. From behind one of the trees emerged a bearded man in furry clothes. The man ran to the monster and snatched his weapon from the big body, and after a while the axe again plunged into the fur, this time into the big head. This blow, and the next one, finally managed to kill the wild wounded animal. Chapter 14. Metkul was lying on the bed, in the tent of Dr. Senvoort. He was listening to a conversation, or rather an argument between Serema and Celian, which was taking place outside. If you hadn't forgotten your head and had arrows, you could have shot this beast. Because of you, Metkul wouldn't have a wounded leg. Serema broke out at the young man. This is not true. Yes, I didn't have any arrows, but by the time I was in the woods Metkul was already wounded. It's not my fault but this aggressive beast. Celian replied in distraught. Do not nooch to me because you will taste the pain of my belt again. I hate you, shouted Celian to the master's face. What did you just say? A man got angry and approached the young man and grabbed him by the collar. After a while, however, David stood between two tall men in defense of Celian. You are harassing all the time, Serema, all the time. Are you bad for Metkul and now you feel sorry for him? If he died, you would probably be happy. That is the truth. I've never seen a more aggressive man than you. Celian saved Metkul's and me's lives, and if he weren't there, you wouldn't have seen me anymore. Instead of rewarding Celian, you will be constantly looking for prey. I'd rather be torn alive by this bear than by you. When I first saw you, I was sure you were a good leader, but I was too wrong, shouted young David to the huge archer. In addition to Metkul, the conversation was also listened to by Malefadin, a man who worked as a lumberjack and a few days ago killed a giant bear, saving Celian from a tragic death. Why does this scout screams so much at this young man? At first I thought they were friends and now they are worse at each other than my own children. Malefadin wondered aloud, stroking his already grey beard. The lumberjack wondered most why the master of the bow continues to bring up this terrible subject and is not happy that no one died. Suddenly, David and the two scouts were visited by a passing lord. Serema, let it go. You have been having a grudge against Celian for a few days now. Even it starts to irritate me. You are not fulfilling your duties now. Besides, you probably weren't in the woods with them so you don't know how it was. Truth? Hendren turned to the scout. That's true. I wasn't in the woods with them, Serema admitted. So it means that everyone else knows the truth. Everyone who was there told me exactly how it was. Metkul saved David, David saved Metkul, Celian saved David, lumberjack Malefadin saved Celian and big dot on the end Serema. End of topic. Yes sir, the scout replied quietly. Good. So I gave you a new order. What order, my lord? The scout became interested. You are forbidden by me to not lash out at the innocent. It's an order, Lord replied. Serema stood at attention and replied to him. Why? Why, yes, sir. After a while, Hendren also turned to David. Are you prepared, David, for tomorrow's travel to Nelthan? Your friends are ready, and they might as well be going today if they could. Is it tomorrow? David was surprised. Of course. Today you have to prepare yourself completely and tomorrow morning there will be a farewell and you will embark on your mission, Hendren replied. Thank you for the information, sir. I mean, Lord, I think I am already prepared. I just have to pack my stuff, Lord. That's good. I can also tell you, David, that we have already prepared armor and a pony for you, a small pony. It was really hard to find something for your size, Lord said, before leaving. I hope you can ride a horse, said Lord at the very end as he disappeared behind one of the tents. David did not answer. He didn't want to admit that he couldn't do that thing either, or just didn't try to ride any animal. No matter the boy bugger it, because of him, Lord will not able to delay the journey, although, probably he himself would not to do it anyway. Serema standing next to him turned and walked towards his white tent with a green bow and arrow painted together. I'm going to pack my stuff, Celian said to David after a while, then ran in another direction to the west side of the camp. There was emptiness all around. Only the lumberjack Malefadin watched David standing alone in the square from afar. After a while, he reached into a leather bag, tinted with yellow and orange, and pulled out a wooden flute. The man sat on the bench next to him and began to play. David heard a jumpy melody coming from behind one of the tents. The boy decided to go in that direction. It was so comfortable that on this side of the camp was his tent. When he went there, he found a source of beautiful music. On the bench sat a flute player who 2 days ago saved Celian and killed an enraged forest beast. Thank you for helping us." Then in the force the boy said, sitting Maleficent even in this position had to look only a little upwards to look David in the eye, without interrupting the game, which was simply the anthem of Ephenestia. He only nodded his head as a sign that he understood. David, who realized that he would not hear an answer from the busy man, went towards his white shelter to pack the necessary things for tomorrow's journey. After a while, he was already in place in his tent lined with mattresses and carpets. David opened the chest and, to his amazement, he saw iron armor inside. The boy picked up his armor and found it to be the perfect size for him and not too heavy. "I knew you would like it," Lord said at the sight of his delight. "This armor was made for you by my best blacksmiths, tanners and other masters from my castle." David suddenly heard a familiar voice behind him. He turned and saw Hendron standing in the entrance. "Uhim, thank you," the boy replied quickly. "Try it on," the Lord encouraged David and then went inside. "What did I deserve for this?" "You did it to deserve it. After all, you have the task of participating in the mission to save our king. You must be prepared to fight and defend David. Besides, I saw that you worked reasonably well, so you can consider it as a reward," replied the Lord, who after a while began to help David put on his armor. The boy threw his white sweatshirt on the ground. "We also prepared food, clothes for a change and a few necessary items for your trip," Hendron said as he began to put on the young man's new disguise. After a while, David looked like a completely different person. He moved and found that the armor was even quite comfortable and very easy to move in. "I also have new shoes for you. Your funny lace-up sneakers are useless." David looked at his sports white and blue shoes. "These are not sneakers." The boy was outraged, who forgot that he was addressing the Lord himself. Hendron, however, was not offended, but looked again at David's shoes. "Well, these shoes do not remind me of desert boots," he said. The boy barely refrained from his squeaky laughter. "What amuses you so much?" asked the Lord, seeing David, who forcibly plugged his mouth so as not to suddenly burst out laughing. "Buha, buicha, ha, buhahara, ha." Unfortunately, David opened his mouth unintentionally. Hendron stepped back a few steps, terrified. "David, maybe you really need a doctor. What made you laugh so much? What wrong did I say?" The Lord heard only a squeaky laugh in response. Sneakers, B, boots." The boy still laughed. What do you mean, boy? What amuses you so much?" Lord continued to ask to no avail, and when he had just begun to shake the boy in all directions, David finally stopped laughing and looked the man right in the face. Hendron crouched down and asked him again more calmly, "What made you laugh so much?" "You call my Adidas sneakers and boots," David replied, laughing. What are Adidas?" "David, come to your senses. Immediately spit out what you have just eaten or drank," shouted at the end scared Lord. "I haven't eaten or drunk anything a moment ago," David replied, this time in a normal voice as if he had never laughed before. "Spit out that damned herbal water before it will be too late. Just don't tell me you drank that damned water from that pagan ancient spring. Human sacrifices used to be made there. This water is cursed." "But I have not drunk anything since the morning." "Oh, I'm hungry too," David replied, not paying any attention to what the Lord was saying. "Are you sure? So why do you act like you've lost all your minds?" asked the man. "Oh, so that's the point. Sorry eyes. Something just made me laugh. Two twin brothers from my class are nicknamed Sneakers." David did not finish because he finally realized that what he had been saying so far was completely pointless, especially when talking to the Lord himself, who comes from another world. Pack your things better and go to bed later. You need to be rested. Maybe a good night's sleep will knock those youthful fools out of your head," said Lord. "Is this young man really a squire of Nanthornian himself?" Lord later wondered quietly, then put David's new leather shoes on the ground and walked out of the tent with quick steps. "How stupid I am," said David to himself as the Lord's figure disappeared from his sight. What bothered him most was the fact that he was able to hear what Hendron was saying to himself under his breath. Everything seemed to indicate that the Lord was probably beginning to doubt him. Suddenly, Maleficent emerged from behind the curtain and asked a surprised David, "Have you heard those unruly screams and laughter? Because of these noises, I could not play the flute in peace." "Who was it?" There was a longer silence, which was finally broken by David. "Person that made these noises is closer than you think." "So it was you?" Maleficent said rather than asked. After a while, the lumberjack received a confirmatory answer through the smile of the young man. And I thought it was some young girl laughing so much. Well, goodbye, Maleficent said, and left. After a while, David heard again the sound made by the wood lumberjack's wooden instrument. When the music finally stopped, the boy began to pack. He tried on his tall, new shoes and they turned out to be very comfortable. I wouldn't be surprised if this leather doesn't exist in my world, thought the amused boy. Tomorrow I'm going on this mission. I'm honestly afraid of what will happen to me there, he finished, bursting out again with unruly, shaky laughter. Nanthonin stood in the tent and looked at the sleeping David, who was lying bent and astride on a mattress as if someone had just thrown him to the ground. Next to him was also a pile of smashed clothes. Nathan went inside after a while. What is it at all? The Lord's servant noticed a snoring young man on the ground. Get up, David, we're about to leave. Nanthonin raised his voice to wake up a little sleeper. David opened his sleepy eyes and looked strangely at the giant. Why so early? He asked. We get up so early, because when you will sleep until noon you will be lazy and you will not have the strength to hike, Nathan replied. I don't have the strength anymore, the boy said. And so you have to get up. We will not postpone the travel because of your laziness. Nathan was outraged. David dallied and finally began to rise slowly. As he stood on his feet, he stretched his sore back and hands. He stated weakly. It's still dark outside. It's going to be clear, Nathan replied seriously. But why get up so early? Because everyone is waiting, and it's only for you, replied the Lord's already impatient servant. The boy again griped over and over again and after a while began to put on jeans and a t-shirt. I always complained when I got up for school, but now it's a big exaggeration. Suddenly exploded in a voice that no longer resembled tired and sleepy. Nathan reflexively jumped up. David had finished putting on his clothes, so he grabbed his armor. Wait a minute, he said more calmly this time. Nathan corrected his chainmail and tunic and then went outside. When the boy finished putting on armor and leather shoes on his own, he followed an older friend. Haven't you forgotten something? He heard Nanthonin's voice behind him as he had already left the tent. David turned and saw a giant holding a sever with his sword. Ag. I keep forgetting that this weapon is no longer yours, the boy excused himself. Then don't forget it. If the Lord found out that you forgot to take a weapon with you, he could say that you are foolish and unfit for our mission. Okay, endorsement. I will always have this weapon with me, assured the young man with a smile on his face. I hope so, kiddo, let's go now. After a while, they turned around and walked towards the large square. Torches and lamps were still burning in the camp. The sky was still very dark blue and only in the distance you could see that it was starting to take on the color of pink. In a moment, a rising sun was about to emerge from that side. As David walked with Nanthonin, he could clearly see the sky getting brighter with each passing moment. I don't really think I've ever seen the sunrise, the boy said, speaking as if to himself. However, he said it at the wrong time because next to him on the bench sat Maleficent, who played his morning melody on the flute. The lumberjack stopped playing for a moment and began to stare at the boy, with surprise and disbelief in his eyes. I mean, I saw the sun rising, but I didn't saw how it's emerge, he corrected quickly, seeing the surprised face of the man. No wonder you haven't seen this very muchly beautiful phenomenon, since you sleep even until noon, Nanthonin said. Hearing this, the lumberjack opened his mouth slightly, not believing. This is not true, I sleep so long only on weekends. David was indignated. Maleficent nodded his head slowly and then started playing again. His music began to be diversified by birds who had just woken up and sung the morning song on nearby trees. After a while, David and his friends found themselves in the great square surrounding the Lord's tent. Around there were people who were waiting to say goodbye and in the middle 8 people who now had a great task. Lord came out of the tent with Methkal, Raven, Serenwa and 2 guards. May you succeed, protect them all, Nanthonin, the Lord said briefly, addressing the warrior and then signaled with his hand so that another person could say goodbye. Raven Murtagh decided to approach us next. I wish you luck. May you all come back safe with health. After these words, he turned to Poppin. Watch out for yourself, my friend. You will not disappoint us. You will not let us down. Goodbye. When everyone was sure that the sage had finished speaking, Methkal stepped forward. The warrior did not speak at all, but began to hug everyone in a friendly way. This time he remembered not to choke David and the two halflings. The giant had to sacrifice himself most with them when hugging because of his injured leg. Finally, after a long farewell to medical ceremony had come up at the end. His farewell was undoubtedly the shortest. Good luck. I hope Celian doesn't cause you trouble. His voice sounded indifferent, there was not a shred of care in it. Tears appeared before Medical's eyes. David, who saw this, said that this giant in such a state looked too strange. Protect them all, Nanthonin, the Lord reminded the warrior. Nanthonin bowed slightly. Of course, he replied. Immediately afterwards, a crowd shouted in honor of the team that was to liberate their king. Goodbye, Maleficent and Turgeon cried out among the crowd. When the people fell silent, Nanthonin turned and signaled with his hand for his companions to follow him, but Bago did not notice anything. He waved like crazy with long hands saying goodbye to the members of the camp. It was only when Poppin poked the skinny in the high leg that he came to his awareness and followed his friends. They were still followed by people without interrupting their farewells. After a while, when the crowd stopped blocking the view, David saw that they were heading towards the stable where some horses were boothing. When they were close, a man came out, who was holding one horse by the bridle. It was a large, muscular black steed with a wild appearance. O great Nanthonin, we have prepared for you our best mount from the land of Steffia itself, the man said to the warrior. Thank you, Netbin, Nanthonin replied. For others, there are also new travel companions waiting. The man turned to the other 6 people pointing to the stable. The biggest problem for us was finding the perfect pony for this boy and halflings. Netbin looked at David, Puppin, and Cordrin. We decided that one of the ponies should be enough for these 3 potolids. After these words, he turned towards the stable and whistled. After a while, a white pony emerged from behind the gate of the wooden building. David was horrified to find that even the pony in this world was enormous. He looked at Nanthonin's horse. Puppin was standing next to him. There are some kinds of jokes, he said, seeing a halfling who could easily be crushed by the big hoof of a steed. The stableman, hearing David scream, twitched as if shocked. What's going on again? Nathan got impatient. You scream like a raging mouse all the time. David twisted his eyes until he suddenly stopped his gaze on the stable. Something began to move in the hay. Suddenly, a huge mouse emerged from there. The boy screamed again. Stop yazzing like that. What's wrong with you? Nathan growled, seeing his little friend squeal for some unknown reason. The cause of the squeak was David's terrible thought, and it was as follows. He thought of an elephant or whale 3 times larger. Why is everything so big here? The boy asked quietly himself. What are you mumbling again? The Lord's servant had just seen David staring at the ground like a fossil. Hello, wake up. Hello, here is the earth. Can you hear us? Began to wittily say these words to the boy and waved his hands in front of his nose. Netbin watched it crooked. Well, no, I think he ate something again, or rather snort, maybe hazel, he added in a serious voice after a while. Nope, nothing happens, David suddenly said that. He jumped up shocked. Here's everything. Here even mice are almost 3 times larger for me. Not my fault, toddler, that you are so small. For me, everything is small, because I'm not small, Nathan said in a thin voice. Maybe you can. Can you kindly interrupt your stupid conversation? Cordrin interjected, pointing to an impatient Netbin who held a handle to the gate to lead more animals outside. After a while, when the man said that peace had come again, he opened the entrance again. 2 more horses came out. Trained scout horse and battle steed. That's it, thank you, Netbin said, then hurriedly walked inside the building to have peace. Wait, where is my horse? Turhin was outraged. Oh Turhin. You can ride with me on a fighting horse. I will watch over you like an eye in my head. Will I be able to drive? The boy asked. Nathan's smile disappeared. Better not. You probably know how to ride a horse, but you have to be safe, he replied carefully. After these words, he took the 10-year-old and sat him on the horse's back. Are we doing the right thing to take Turhin with us? Cordrin asked Poppin quietly. Do not be afraid, Turhin is not an ordinary boy. I trained with him to fight. No one knows about it, but sooner or later they will find out that this boy is a real strong man. What if something bad happens to him along the way? His parents will be devastated, said a halfling. Yes, but Turhin has no parents, Puppin replied. What? Surprised Cordrin. So where does he live? How's that where? In the camp, of course. For several years he has been working here as an orphan and helps in the kitchen, canteen or blacksmith. He told me about it himself and I saw him more than once when he was helping. Ag, that's good to know, Cordrin replied. To tell the truth, I'm more worried about David, not Turhin, said Poppin. Chapter 15. David clung to the horse's mane so as not to fall. When the pony suddenly jumped over one of the stones, the boy desperately jerked the horse's mane so as not to fly. Nathan, seeing this, couldn't help but laugh. The boy looked like a shaking bag of potatoes. Don't squirm like that, cried Cordrin, who was sitting behind the young man's back. Why did no one teach him to ride a horse? Nathan asked pretentiously. But how were we supposed to know that David could not ride a horse? After all, even 3-year-old children can do it, replied Turhin. But why can't he do it at all? Wondered Nathan. David, your father didn't teach you? He asked the young man. Horse riding does not have to be taught only by the father. My great-grandmother taught me this, Poppin interjected with a smile on his face. David grabbed his head. Quietly please. He did not finish his speech, because suddenly the horse jumped again and he himself fell to hard ground. I can't stand it. I will walk, whether you like it or not, the boy decided, rising slowly from the ground. Of course, I had to fall on my back again. He got angry. You have to finally learn to drive well. In fact, on the back of the horse you do not need to do practically anything. This horse is so trained that he can go where you want. You just have to learn how to balance your body in the saddle without having to use a bridle because you look like a dog while driving, Nathan replied with a smile. You did it convince me. Since this horse is so trained, tell him to stop jumping. I will never sit on this beast again. I have never experienced so many falls as here. My leg was blowing, then it was crushed by a giant and now, recently misfortune has taken on my back. My bones have been hurting for a few days now. Nathan burst out laughing when he heard the boy complaining. Just don't cry my little poor boy, he said, amused, pretending to have the voice of a worried woman. David, don't complain. When I was a little smaller than you, I trained to be a scout by jumping from the first floor of my house. Celia joined the conversation. After a while, he started laughing. Ah, how stupid I was then. My parents literally hated me when I came to them every day dirty and hurt. When they found out that I wanted to be a scout, they took advantage of this and got rid of me by sending me to Serama's service. Celia started laughing like a child again. What stupidity I was doing then. Sometimes my father wanted to beat me up, but when he saw such a battered kid, he thought it would be cruel to beat his battered son. But why did you do it at all? Did you train to be a scout by jumping from the first floor? David was surprised. When I was such a little brat, I said that this way I would be stronger and braver, the scout replied, laughing. Scouts must be physically fit, so I think that the ability to jump from a height would be useful to me. To some extent this is true, but more than once I broke my arm when something went wrong. It's really a very interesting story, David said, but there was a hint of amusement in his voice. And I climbed to the very roof of the highest tower in Hedron, Turhin boasted as another of his stupidities. And why did you do it? David was interested. Once, my friend's kite got stuck on this tower. I wanted to impress her. Since then, climbing has become my hobby. Oh dear. I think I ended up in some band of idiots and suicides, David said in his mind, and I jumped from the bridge. The silence was broken by Nathan. I used to go to the den of Teddy Bear, Bago boasted. I secretly entered Selif's house and played with his spear, added the Lord's servant. After a while, a real Hamida was created. Everyone started shouting who had done the most stupid things in their lives. Ha, I was stealing cakes from Lord's castle kitchen, Nathan continued to shout. I was shooting with eggs from a slingshot at the guards, Turhin boasted. I jumped on the roofs of the tallest houses in Riena, Celian shouted. And I was struggling with a huge catfish. Bago was trying to get attention. Sears and hearing this David, Poppin and Cordrin tried not to pay attention to it. The 13-year-old plugged his ears and Nanthorn and began to whistle loudly. Poppin, Cordrin, do we have at least 4 corks with us? David asked. The halflings looked at the boy with an ununderstanding look. I would gladly plug their mouths. David satisfied the curiosity of the halflings. Well, corks are in water bags or bottles, Cordrin replied quietly. David thanked him with a nod and then walked over to his horse on which the saddlebags were hanged. He took his water bottle from his bag and unscrewed the cork. Then he stepped on his horse, laughing. Next, Nathan sitting on his steed became the first victim. The boy simply put a cork in Nathan's mouth. The young man opened his eyes and was horrified to find that something was plugging his mouth. When he found out what was the reason for this, he spat out a wooden cork as soon as possible and then looked at the smiling David. TWOU also stopped laughing when he saw what had happened to Nathan, who almost swallowed a small object. There are only 2 people left. David chose Cillian as the next. "Watch out," TWOU shouted to the scout, but it was too late. Cillian's mouth immediately stopped moving. Cillian bulked his eyes. "What has happened?" he managed to ask through a clogged mouth. When he did, however, the cork flew into his throat. Cillian began to choke. When Bago stopped laughing and saw his friend choking, he began to beat him on the back with a big like a paw hand. The scout lost his balance due to the force of the impact and fell from the horse. Hitting the ground, the cork shot out of his mouth like from a cannon. The victim of David began to cough. My ear hurts." He began to scream after a while as if he was crazy. Papin looked at Cillian lying down with compassion. "What did you do, David? You could have killed us." Nathan was outraged. "I wrote that if I calmed you down in this way, we could move on," the boy replied innocently. "So, maybe we'd better go," Caudrin said. Papin stared at the fidgeting Cillian holding his left ear in horror. After a while, he decided to approach the man and check what was wrong with the scout's ear. The halfling raised Cillian's head and looked at his sore spot. "I can't see anything here," he said. "You must have just fallen on the left side of your head and it hurts you." Papin reached out to help his friend get up from the ground. "But no, wait, something is vibrating in my ear, it pinches and hurts," Cillian shouted to the halfling. "Everything is okay." Papin comforted him, seeing that his companion was lying on the soft grass. There was a momentary silence. After a while, Papin opened his mouth again to add something, but suddenly he jumped up sharply as if he saw something strange or even terrible. Cillian, I think I already know why your ear hurts so much," he replied, and then tightened his mouth strangely. Curious, David came closer to see what was going on. When he looked at his friend's sore auditory organ, all his traveling companions heard his squeaky scream. Hearing this, TWOU fell to the ground in fear, but no one paid attention to it except Nanthornian, who picked up the boy. David and the rest were looking at a large spider that emerged from inside a scout's ear. "Do not movement, I'm rescuing you," shouted Bago suddenly, and then took a long stick from the ground. Cillian guessed what the mudman was about to do. "No. Not, please, don't do it," he screamed, but it was too late. The team saw Bago accurately aim the end of the stick in his ear. Cillian, however, did not scream, but twitched and shot at his eyes like a frog. "Dr. Bago is the best to help everything," replied proudly Muddy, and pulled out a stick with a spider impaled on it. When the scout saw it, only then did he start screaming. Only now he learned what was vibrating in his ear. Where did it come from, that spider, wondered David. Probably when Cillian fell and lay on the ground, he just got there. TWOU replied, "Why did you pull this spider out of me in such a brutal way?" Cillian was outraged. "You not Cillian that Bago do everything the most, the best, the most faster and the most effective," replied Mudman. "Yes, that's true. I remember how Bago saved me the best, the fastest and the most effectively when I was hanging over the precipice," Nathan said in a laughing voice. "Oh yeses, I am the best doctor and rescuer, at your service," Bago boasted. "Certainly," Papin said. Nathan laughed for good. "Can we go on?" asked David in an impatient but calm voice. Everyone looked at the boy who was sitting on his pony. "David, I think you've finally learned to stay in the saddle," Papin noted. "Indeed. When this stupid kid stuck this cork in my mouth, he drove up to me on a horse to reach me," admitted Nathan. David looked at himself and then at his companions. I just think I'm used to it. I didn't even pay attention to it," he replied quietly. "That's a miracle," shouted Bago, suddenly raised his brown eyes and grabbing his head. The boy soothed and slapped over his forehead. He began to mutter something under his breath. The only 2 words that could be heard were, "What a miracle." Bago did not cease to rejoice in the young friend's new achievement. David could not stand it anymore, so he drove away on a pony, leaving behind 2 halflings who were to take their places behind him. After a while, he heard a voice behind him. Wait, and we what? The 13-year-old, however, no longer paid attention to Poppin and Cordrin but headed further north to the top of Mount of Natha. Seeing this, Bago without a word grabbed both halflings with large and long hands and seated them on his bay horse. We'd better follow him or we'll lose him, Nethin said, then followed the boy. Immediately behind him moved others except Celian, who was lying and could not get on the mound. Fortunately, the trained horse understood what was going on, so he made it easier for his owner to enter by approaching one of the boulders. Thanks to this, the scout could climb the stone and then sat on the back of the full-legged animal. You will never leave me and you will be my best friend, true my horse, Celian spoke to the animal. The animal snorted and shook its head, as if want to say yes. Oh, how good you are, horse, Celian said, and then he began to think about something. And you're the male or the female, because I was just going to give you a name. When the scout wanted to get off the mount to take a closer look at it and find out what gender it was, however, he heard the voice of his companions. Hurry up, why do you stand like a peg? Celian drove up to his friends. Can we go now? David asked again impatiently. I want to find out first, the young scout began, pointing to his mount. Everyone turned into hearing. Do you know what gender my horse is? You don't know? Surprised Cordrin. This is her. You can immediately see that this is a mare. Poppin satisfied Celian's curiosity. The scout looked at his mount again and then smiled goofy. Oh. It's good to know because I was just wondering whether to call his pelage. Poppin frowned his forehead and made a strange face. I guess you wanted to say that you wanted to call her, not him, Cordrin corrected. Then I'll call him Pelagella, Celian replied. Hearing this, Poppin grabbed his head. Everything else burst out laughing. Well, what? A bad name. He is so fluffy, asked Celian, not knowing what the comrades meant. David fitted in the saddle and began to try to sit in a more comfortable position. My ass starts to hurt. Maybe we will take a short break to stretch at least our legs, he groaned. At first you rush and patient everyone to ride, and now you demand a rest, Nethin snorted. Soon we will reach my hiding place, there we will be able to rest, Terhin replied calmly. You quickly learned to ride a horse, David, but you're still sitting in the saddle not properly, that's why you're so uncomfortable, Poppin noted. You have to be more relaxed, David, don't sit so stiffly, Cordrin added. Okay, that's good, the boy replied and then acted as his comrades recommended him. Horse riding quickly became his new passion, but he still had a lot to learn. After a dozen or so minutes, he finally saw the entrance to the gorge covered with creepers through which the hole was practically not visible. The team barely squeezed through the tangle of plants. After a minute, however, they were already in a cozy shelter hollowed out in the rock. Everyone sat on pillows, carpets and blankets except David, who wanted to stretch his legs and get rid of the pain in his buttocks. Now he had the opportunity to take a closer look at the hiding place. The last time he was in here, there was dark and he wasn't too interested in this place. To his surprise, he saw a large clock in the corner striking almost 12 o'clock at noon. And that's weird. However, they have clocks here, but they can't even make an airplane out of paper, he said in a hushed voice. Next to the clock there was something like a wooden booth. David guessed what it might be, but he decided to look inside anyway. He was right. When he opened the door, he saw a toilet above which there was a small mirror. Next to it was also a bowl of clean water. These are some jokes. This toilet even has a flush, he noted. What did you say? Terhin asked. You? Nothing but, you have arranged yourself well here, like in an apartment, the boy replied and then went out and sat down with his friends. Maybe we can talk about something? He asked. I know. We will come up with names for our mounts, Celian replied. It's a good idea, Nethin said. So I've already come up with a new and better name for my mare, the scout boasted. What name? Terhin became interested. I'll call her Hitter because she's banging her hooves like a monster at a gallop, Celian replied in a laughing voice. And I will name my horse Greaser, Bago shouted suddenly squeaky. David plugged his mouth so as not to laugh. I can call my steed Netta, from the first letters of my name and Terhin's, Nethin said. Nanthornin, what do you call your horse? Asked the dark-haired boy, curious as always. Let it be Nantha, That means, a gale, the warrior replied after a moment of reflection. When he said this, everyone turned their eyes to David. The boy did not have to wonder what his companions meant. Everyone was curious what name he would give to his pony. For a long time there was a deafening silence. My horse shines like metal and is white, so I'll call him Blisk, he finally said. Oh, what does metal have to do with some Blisk? What is Blisk anyway? Asked Nethin. Blisk means flash and polish, Pupping replied. Hearing this, David balled his eyes. How do you know that? He asked quietly. But what language? What polish? What polished? Nethin was surprised, not understanding anything. No matter, there are things that are sometimes hard to explain, replied the halfling. Nethin nodded his head as a sign that he understood and decided not to speak again. He preferred not to bother with this thing. Others have done so as well. There was silence again, but after a while something interrupted it, the sound of someone's steps. I think someone is going, David said. We'll see who it is. I can clearly hear that this person is approaching to us, Nethin added. The team did not have to wait long. After a while, a young man jumped inside nimbly. When he saw 8 people sitting around a low table, he almost jumped up in fear. I'm sorry, I'm looking for... The young man did not finish his speech, because he just saw one of the higher figures hiding in the shadows rise abruptly from his place. Intruder! He suddenly heard a scream. The skinny character began to approach. When this person emerged from the shadows, the uninvited visitor could only see his grey face, brown eyes, and long nose. The young man could not see more because he was suddenly grabbed by a big, skinny hand. He started screaming, but after a while the hand dropped him. Now the stranger was next to David. The boy looked more closely at the intruder. He had dark hair, blue eyes, and a short beard that indicated that the man was a little older than Nethin and Celian. "Are you Intrudelman?" asked Bago. I'm Epiphanist. My father Maleficent sent me to the great warrior Nanthonin. Please, mercy." The man began to shout with terrified voice into the sky. "I'm Nanthonin," said another figure hiding in the shadows. "That's you?" Epiphanist wanted to make sure. The warrior looked so that the young man could see his face. "Oh, my father sent me here he want to give you a weapon, I mean, Lord, sword, because we have noticed that you have nothing to defend," Epiphanist replied, barely jamming every now and then. "I have given my sword to one of my companions," said the warrior, pointing his head at David. "Yes, but you are now defenseless, master. That's what I've heard from at least another heroist and medical," the young man replied as he watched the giant. After a while, he noticed that the other one was nodding. "Okay, show us the sword. We would be fools not to accept this gift from you," Nethin said. The newcomer began to hastily pull something out of his colorful bag decorated with gold threads and buttons. "To be honest, I didn't just bring a sword with me," he said, pulling out a jar of jam. Nethin twisted his eyes at the sight, and David's saliva began to drip. He licked his lips like a hungry dog and began to look at what else the lumberjack's son had prepared for them. The young man pulled out his morals that reminded David of donuts. Nethin grabbed his head, not believing. In the eyes of the mudman, desire appeared. "And what are we going to do with it?" asked Poppin himself, shaking his head. Epiphanist, however, did not stop pulling out of the bag things that seemed unnecessary to the team, of course, except for Bago and David. For these 2 people, all these pastries seemed essential in their stomachs. It was only after a long while that the newcomer finally drew his sword. Nanthonin looked closely at the weapon. It was quite similar to the sword that he gave to David so much, but that weapon had a shorter handle and the blade was not as thin as paper. 6 people from the team were looking at weapons, while the other 2, Bago and David, were staring at food. Muddy glanced at the rest of the comrades who were busy watching and weighing the weapons to determine what quality the sword is. "It's certainly Turgeon's job," Nanthonin said. When Bago heard this, he looked at the pastries and preserves again and grabbed them with handfuls. He greedily pushed the cake into his mouth. The mudman-like face doubled as he accumulated food in his cheeks. David also followed in his example.